Welcome to everyone, and thank you very much indeed for joining us for this webinar about the integration of planning and transport. I have to say this is a completely new experience for me, chairing one of these events or even attending one, so I hope it all goes smoothly. It's an extremely interesting time at the moment to be discussing this particular subject, so I'm looking forward to both the presentations and also the discussion and questions afterwards. My name's Linda Addison. I'm chair of the Sustainable Transport Panel for the Chartered Institute of Highways and Transport and led the work that the CIHT, the Royal Town Planning Institute and the Transport Planning Society did with others on better planning, better transport and better places. I also am the former chair of the Transport Planning Society, so that's just me. I've got with me two key speakers who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience, plus two very, very different perspectives on this particular subject. They are Cullen Riley, who's the director of PJA, and Tony Cacaboni, who is the Surface Access Director for Heathrow. Unfortunately, as of this morning, David Harris, who's Transport Strategy and Place Manager for the Transport for West Midlands, has had to pull out at the last minute. So apologies from him. Very sorry not to be part. In a moment, I'm going to pass you over to the speakers, but in the meantime, can I just remind you how you can get involved in this webinar? You've joined us in a listen-only mode, but you will have a dialogue box, hopefully, down the right-hand side of your screen. And we would like you to type in questions during the presentations or afterwards and encourage you to take part and do the questions for the speakers. At the end of the two speakers, we will have a question and answer session, and hopefully I'm looking forward to lots of really interesting questions to them. So that's all I need to say at this point in time. Can I now pass you over to Cullen, who's going to start the presentations, and he's then going to be followed by Tony, but I'll come back to you in between.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just in the process of closing down everything that doesn't need to be seen, and we'll progress with the presentation. Bear with me. So, Cullen Riley, PJA, known to hopefully lots of you as formerly as Phil Jones Associates. I've been with PJA now 7 years and a number of decades experience as a transport planner, primarily in private sector development planning role. My recent enthusiasm is within GIS data. Everybody seems to be interested in data, but actually making that wealth of data out there in the marketplace with regards to transport and planning, and bringing it into a world where the data starts to tell the story or explain the narrative. And today, one of those particular areas where PJA have been focusing on is understanding town centres and the data that's available within town centres from a transport and a community perspective. In 2014, DCLG undertook a study of town centres in England, and part of the data set within that study was to understand vacancy rates as a straightforward floor area function of the high street, just how empty or full in terms of retail floor space were our high streets. We've managed to interpret that data, bring it into a GIS informatics format, and started to ask questions about the design, the planning, the nature, the structure of our high streets and our towns, to understand whether there were any connections to the level or degree to which high streets were vacant or the empty shops. Mapping that, there's an awful lot of data in the DCRG study, shown on the right-hand side there. Anywhere from 8–6% vacancy rates. So that's the percentage is relating to the total gross floor area deemed to be retail within the high street. Obviously, we weren't going to identify and run a study on all of the data, so we focused on the top 3 and bottom 3 performing towns within the 2014 study, with regards to the highest levels and lowest levels of vacancy rates. Oxford came out the best performing, for want of a better word, in terms of only 4.3% of its available retail floor space was deemed to be vacant, with Blackburn being the worst performing, with nearly 36% of its available retail floor space empty. The questions we started to ask ourselves was, is there something specific in the connectivity, the layout, and the interaction between first mile residential distribution and the location of the high street in relation to where people lived? And within the GIS format, we then developed a first mile, last mile tool, for want of a better word, to start to try and understand why the vacancy rates in these 6 towns were what they are. Just to give some background in terms of the first mile, last mile connectivity approach, it's a spatial analysis of existing residential origins down to individual plot level, and the nodes and roads, for want of a better thing, the routes and the nodes that are connected from those residential origins, and the routes and the nodes that connect those origins with the last mile destination. And within that, we've developed what we think is quite a clever tool for understanding spatial relationships within the first mile, last mile. And I'm just going to walk you through in detail Oxford, and then at the end show you the results and the comparisons across the 6 identified towns. So Oxford itself, for those not familiar, is quite a small, compact centre with some high density of residential areas in the neighbourhood. The connectivity in terms of those residential areas within the first mile, as you can see, is centred to the south and the east of what's been identified as Oxford's town centre, retail centre. And what we found when we looked into the first mile connectivity is that there are lots of areas within the city where connectivity in the first mile is quite low, and then there are areas where that connectivity and the first mile connections is quite high and focused in 1–2 particular areas. We then looked at the last mile connectivity in terms of, given a retail destination, how interconnected are the routes and the nodes in and around those retail destinations. And from the study, we found quite discrete and distinct areas within the city where the retail last mile connectivity was particularly high. So we have these 2 areas: residential connectivity quite high in very localized areas, and last mile connectivity compacted in and around the centres. We brought those data sets together, overlaid them, and then looked at the quality, the interconnection that occurs between the first mile origin and the last mile destination, with particular focus on retail on the high street. And what we found, in particular for Oxford and for the top performing centres in the study, was that there is a high degree of intersection and interaction in that first mile, last mile overlay. That means residential areas are closely connected with the last mile retail trip and trip making. And we were surprised that in some instances, with particular interest in Oxford, that the highest degree of interaction, the highest degree of connectivity between the first and the last mile wasn't necessarily where we understood the traditional high street to be for the city, but actually it was located out towards, and for those that know, areas as Iffley and to the southeast of the city, was a particular surprise to us, as we were expecting it to be located more in the city centre. And essentially we then transferred that to say, well, are there characteristics and similarities between those of the top performing centres, and are there major differences between what performs well in terms of low vacancy rates and what performs poorly in terms of high vacancy rates? So as a comparison between Oxford, Cambridge and York, with the same first mile, last mile interaction, and Blackburn, Walsall and Wigan, we found in the top performing centres there were these pockets, these hotspots of overlay between residential first mile and retail last mile connections, and real defined community centres where the function of living and the function of shopping were supported and enabled by this close connectivity. And not surprisingly, as we had hoped, there was a very distinct difference between the lower performing centres in that they didn't have these hotspots. There were pockets where first mile and last mile combined, but not to any cohesive degree of providing a real community focus, a real community centre. And the understanding that now comes out of that, and the work that's been ongoing since this work, is that we're now trying to look at health statistics and all of the other data that come, crime statistics, travel to work, all of the other data, to understand, is this first mile, last mile interaction a positive step forward in terms of the way we integrate planning? And having that understanding, it's something instinctive to us, that as long as you connect first and last mile, everything should be okay. We don't always do it, and having it as an empirical test and rolling it out to the other centres in the study to see empirically if this relationship persists, I think gives us some big keys in the future about where do we put and how do we put land uses in the planning system to ensure these hotspots, these community hotspots of first and last mile, to ensure that interaction. Some of the other functions that we're going on to test is what lines, what routes, what interconnections can you put in place that improve first mile, last mile connectivity? What are the modal differences that would infrastructure balance that can deliver an improvement to the creation of community hotspots? So thank you very much for that. I hope that's given you a taste of where we've gone and has inspired a whole raft of questions and enthusiasm for this relationship of first mile, last mile interaction in planning towns and cities as we go forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Colin. That was really interesting, and I do hope we're going to get lots of questions. Please, can I encourage you to put your questions in for the discussion at the end of the next presentation. So I'm going to move then quite swiftly on to Tony, who's going to give you a very different view in a very interesting time for Heathrow Airport, I think. So I look forward to hearing Tony's presentation.
Thanks, Linda. And good morning, everyone. And thank you particularly to the Smart Transport team today for organising this webinar and providing me with the opportunity to speak with you all. I hope you're all well and coping at home. It's a pleasure to be speaking with everyone, although under very different circumstances from which I originally intended. My name is Tony Cacavoni. I'm the Surface Access Director at Heathrow. That means that my job is essentially to transform the way both our passengers and our colleagues travel to and from the airport. That's across all transport modes, whether that's bus, coach, train, taxi, car, cycling and walking. And what I'm going to talk to you today is a little bit about what's happening at Heathrow at the moment, but also how our ambitions are for the future in spite of the current crisis with coronavirus and also the recent Supreme Court ruling. So let me move on a slide. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the current situation that we find ourselves in at Heathrow. Coronavirus has created the biggest crisis the aviation sector has ever experienced. As the UK's biggest airport, we're at the forefront of this challenge. Heathrow employs more than 76,000 people, and 1 in 4 local households rely on Heathrow for their livelihood. 40% of the UK's exports by value to non-EU countries go through the cargo hold of passenger planes from Heathrow every year, and we're the largest port in the country. Anything high value with a short shelf life or just in timely supply chain goes on a passenger plane from Heathrow. Up until the COVID crisis, we had very few cargo only flights. The cargo all went in passenger aircraft. So we're not just an airport, we're an enabler and a catalyst for the rest of the economy. And that's why we've been able to keep Heathrow open and operating safely in these recent weeks. This has been to help repatriate thousands of British citizens from all over the world and to bring in cargo freighters and carrying essential PPE for the NHS. It's been incredible to see the industry respond to this challenge with limited resources, and I'm sure you've all seen pictures of passenger planes loaded with vital cargo, whether that's in the belly hold or actually passenger cabins being converted to hold the cargo themselves. In these abnormal times, we're acting as an air bridge for the UK, playing our part to support the national response to the health crisis and to protect as many jobs as possible and to save our business. With everything that's unfolded over the past 2 months, some of my objectives have had to change as well, and I want to take you through where we've been and where we're going. It's hard to believe that last year we served over 80 million passengers, and that's one of only 7 airports ever to achieve that milestone. But our recent figures show that passenger numbers declined by over 18% during the first quarter of the year to 14.6 million. And in April alone, our passenger numbers are expected to be down by around 97%. Where a lot of work has previously been into accommodating all our passengers across all 4 terminals, our teams are now focused on consolidating operations in 2 terminals with just one runway operating. So what does that mean for me? As the business adapts and responds to the crisis, my team's work continues, albeit in a very different way. The pillars of our strategy still stand, and that's to providing the best service and the most sustainable choices. When we have beaten this virus, we will need to get Britain flying again so that the economy can recover as fast as possible. We believe that aviation will recover, and we also believe that the biggest long-term challenge facing the industry still remains tackling climate change. We want to reduce the number of people driving their cars on roads in and around Heathrow. This reduces congestion and helps protect local air quality by tackling vehicle emissions. We want people to think differently about how they travel to and from the airport. All this links to Heathrow 2.0, our overall sustainability strategy. It outlines our ambitious plans to make the airport a centre for excellence and create a future where local communities can thrive. But we will need to adjust to this new post-world, post-coronavirus. We need people to feel that they're able to travel safely and more sustainably. We need to find ways and means to allow people to do this. We're continuing to work with our partners, including the Heathrow Area Transport Forum. Their work, led by Independent Chair Val Shawcross, continues. They will continue to scrutinise our plans and hold us to account as they should. And to achieve them, we will need to work with government partners and other organisations to adjust. It would be easy to forget about carbon reduction in face of the crisis, but it would be an even bigger mistake to miss the threat of climate change and jeopardise the progress that was made pre-coronavirus. A key part of this is our long-term commitment to delivering a sustainable future for aviation. It's critical to remember that carbon is the enemy, not aviation. The UK aviation sector has taken a global lead in committing to meet the Paris Accord target of net zero emissions by 2050. This plan should now be to accelerate this, not to slow down. For example, as part of any post-crisis economic regeneration plan, the government could stimulate development of sustainable aviation fuel production in the UK with the investment and jobs which would accompany it. In addition, any company-specific recovery plans for carbon-intensive industries, including aviation, should come with a commitment to faster decarbonisation. We've already proved that it's possible to decouple passenger growth from a rise in carbon emissions. Since 2005, while UK passenger numbers have grown by 25%, there's been a 3% reduction in carbon emissions. So even as passenger numbers grow again, we can match this with an even greener approach to aviation. To tackle that carbon challenge, we need to be ambitious, implementing change and stimulating new industries and surface access projects that will enable the country to thrive. Earlier this year, leaders from the UK aviation industry came together to become the first national sector to commit to net zero by 2050. We also published our 8-point plan to help shift UK aviation to net zero by 2050. In short, we're getting our own house in order, working with our partners both on the ground and in the air. But as things change in the industry, we will need the government support to deliver our long-term objectives. We cannot achieve these ambitions without innovating, of course. New technologies and systems will be needed to adjust to changing behaviours, guidelines and habits, and this will underpin our airport's operations for years to come. We need to model and plan for whatever disruption and changes the future will bring. We're already working with the aviation industry and policymakers here and in other countries to establish consensus on the need for common international standards on future measures for health in aviation. We believe that the UK government could provide a lead in defining this, just as they have done so with security standards. But in our view, any measures agreed must meet 3 criteria. Firstly, they must be medically effective. Secondly, there must be something that meets consumer expectations in terms of safety, security and convenience. And thirdly, there must be something that airports can implement and deliver. Public Health England has concluded that temperature testing at airports is ineffective once community transmission of the virus is widespread. However, it does not mean it will not have to have an important role to play once community transmission has been brought under control. Similarly, social distancing in any form of public transport is something which is only possible with very low passenger numbers. So while it has a role to play right now, it is not a solution at any scale and could compromise full recovery. We therefore need to adopt new strategies and technologies to ensure that there are strong health measures when people make their journeys. We need to take advantage of new construction and surface access projects that are ready to go and drive growth. The construction industry is proven to create jobs and stimulate local economies. We've already made great progress in developing new and radical solutions to surface access provision at Heathrow. One example I'd like to share with you today is our work on intelligent mobility. The means of passengers travelling to the airport in a smarter way, taking advantage of technology and information available to them. There are so many areas to consider. We've conducted extensive research to understand how we can improve services. This research has shown us that passengers and our colleagues value three important characteristics: speed, ease, and trust. We've all had the fears. Will my train arrive on time? Can I store my luggage? Is it safe? Is it secure? What if there's a delay? Will I miss my shift at work, or will I miss my flight? Everything we do is therefore designed to improve our passenger experience, whether airline passengers or our colleagues on the surface network. A key part of work that my team does is modelling and understanding the trends that will impact future travel demands. Travel preferences and new technologies impact how we choose to travel. For example, the addition of using contactless on the tube and now Heathrow Express has made a big difference to make journeys easier. The rise of ride-hailing apps has made a profound impact on how people travel to and from the airport, and we've had to respond. That response has been to introduce our authorised vehicle area, a dedicated area for private hire vehicles to wait before picking up jobs at the airport. We've worked with ride-hailing apps to geofence the airport to prevent drivers waiting in residential streets. This has worked in part, but there is still much more work to be done in getting the smaller independent private hire drivers and chauffeurs to comply, as we still see many of those impacting on our local residents and local communities. We will all need to innovate and work with partners to improve and adjust the passenger journey as we recover. That's why these factors, speed, ease and trust, are underpinning our work to improving passenger experience and limiting concerns. Our intelligent mobility plans are about using innovative technologies, ideas and data. But it's also about getting the right information to passengers in a timely way. We're working on improving information to passengers and colleagues alike, and the way that information is communicated through better journey planners. We're also moving towards introducing a Heathrow travel wallet to support colleagues' journeys so that they can bank points when travelling, take advantage of discounts and use our car sharing scheme, LiftShare, one of the biggest in the UK. We're also looking for partners, be it businesses, industry groups or the government. We look forward to collaborating more in future to achieve this with stakeholders like yourselves and with the support of government. While we all adjust to the new challenges we face, we need to think about how we rebuild confidence in our public transport systems and how we innovate to deliver a more seamless, sustainable future. Thank you very much for your time and happy to take questions. Back to you, Linda.
Thank you very much indeed, Tony. Right, we have two really very interesting presentations and I have quite a lot of questions, so I'm just trying to make sure I can see the questions now. She says, so where's my screen gone? Right, so I'm just trying to bring up the questions. Sorry, it's a bit slow because my computer's decided I can't see what's happening. So right, good. There we go. Oh, no, it's not. Right. So one of the first questions I got was very much directed to you, Cullen, and that's around, was the economic status of the surrounding residential areas taken into account? And if not, what effect would this have had on the study results? That's from John Craft.
Yes, we do have the economic data in the background. I didn't want to overload everybody with a whole load of GIS plots that we're all more than used to looking at. What we did in the presentation was just to focus on the pure first last mile connectivity, rather than to try and blur the lines between economic, and we also took into account employment factors. So behind the research are the correlations between levels of employment, levels of education, and levels of household income. So those plots are in there, and yes, there are relationships in terms of basket size and shopping and the prosperity of the high street, but that doesn't actually affect the interconnectivity of the first and the last mile. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. That was from John Craft. Right, the next question, which I'm going to stick with your questions at the moment, because I think that seems the most appropriate way, is I've got a question, is could it be argued that the higher performing cities and towns are likely to have much higher levels of tourism compared with the lower performing centres? And if tourism is greater, will it bring in more money to the town, city or town? And that's from Ben Mallon.
Yeah, undoubtedly the top performing centres have a certain notoriety as being tourist destinations, and yes, it could be argued that the high street is therefore more prosperous and a more attractive option for a retailer. But we very much looked at the function of the high street as a community hub for live, work, play operations, rather than as a tourist function. Actually, some of the more interesting things is that it won't have passed people's notice. The top performing towns are historic university towns, and we did play with a lot of historical maps, where for Oxford in particular, we've got a map from 1814 that we've geo-referenced into the database, and the hotspots that come out in the first last mile intersection are actually where the town centre was way back in 1814. Just an interesting thing.
Very interesting. Right, I was going to ask a question from Sarah, but unfortunately she's just left, so I'm going to leave that one behind. And I'm going to go on to someone whose name I can't see. Thank you for interesting insights. Was underutilization of parking infrastructure taken into account to facilitate first last mile integration and improve interconnections in the form of multimodality hubs?
It's been taken into account in the analysis that we're doing now to understand further. But actually what was really interesting is that we didn't want to prejudge anything. And this is literally an infrastructure driven assessment of interconnectivity. So there are no factors. We haven't fudged the hotspots. These hotspots are physically there or absent in the top and lower performing. There are no other contributory factors in the final slide, in the comparison slide.
Thank you. Moving on to a different aspect, and I'm going to ask a couple more questions for you, Cullen, and then I'm going to go to Tony and see where we go time-wise. Is it possible to overlay commuting so that your analysis includes this critical contribution to CO2 emissions, congestion, and poor air quality? If not, we can probably help. That's Mark Hand.
Yes, we do have journey to work data OD data in the model itself, and we can produce the plots that show the correlation between first last mile integration. We also have first last mile integration between transport nodes as well as a layer within the research. So, this was what we've displayed in terms of retail. As soon as you change the last mile destination point, you get a whole load of different maps. But actually, what is consistent in the top performing towns is the hotspots, the community hotspots, don't actually change significantly, even when you change the destination.
Right, thank you. And the last one then for you at the moment is, what is the exact definition of the last mile? That's from Gavin Wicks. No,
So
it isn't.
the exact, the technology, the approach that we used in assessing the routes and nodes is exactly that. We took a geographical distance, cracked open the network to count the number of routes and nodes that were connected to each other within the last mile of the chosen destination. So it is a physical geographical mile.
Right, good. Let's move to Heathrow then. And Victoria Trusova is asking, what is the modal split to and from Heathrow now, and what is the target modal split in the future?
Okay, so I'll take the last part of that question first. The target in the future is for a 50% mode share, public transport mode share target, rising to 55% in the longer term. Today, we see, and when I say today, the most current data we've got effectively stems from 2019, and we're running at about 40% public transport mode share at the moment. So our ambitions are to stretch from 40% to 50% and 55% public transport mode share. Right,
thank you. This is from Gavin Wicks, would a strategy of spreading passenger and staff access be helped by 24-hour service of public transport? Could this be made possible and still allow a time for maintenance?
So number of things at play here, and what we've been working to for many years at Heathrow is extending the provision of public transport outside of what we would call the standard peak hours for commuting, because many of our operations at the airport start much earlier than the standard peak and finish much later. So for a number of years we funded early morning and late night bus routes where they wouldn't otherwise be commercially viable, because many of our operational staff need to be reporting for shift at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning before start of operations, and then similarly at the other end of the day as well. Obviously, we're as an airport trying to balance and avoid wherever possible operations late into the night because of the impacts that has on our local residents. But a longer operating period for public transport is absolutely something that we've been aiming for and continuing to drive for.
Thank you very much. And still sticking with Heathrow, a question from James Bailey. Have you considered using electric buses to shuttle passengers from long stay car parks to the terminal?
Yes, and that's very much in our plans, and we were charging ahead with our provision of electric infrastructure on the airport and working with our operators to see how we can get more electric buses onto airport operations. That's effectively been put on hold at the moment as we're dealing with a COVID-19 crisis. But we were working, and I was hoping to be able to announce something later this year. But obviously that's on hold at the moment. But we were quite far advanced in our thinking on that.
Right, so that will come back presumably when things are slightly more settled than they are.
Yeah, absolutely. It remains a key part of our strategy to increase the electric charging infrastructure on the airport and encourage both our transport operators and our colleagues and passengers to travel to the airport via electric vehicles.
Right, and sticking again with Heathrow, a question from Paul LeBlanc. Will a two-runway Heathrow require a vehicle access charge to meet the No More Airport Road Traffic pledge?
So that's something we're working through at the moment, Paul. I think what is one of my biggest worries at the moment is the impact that COVID-19 is going to have on people's likelihood to travel by public transport. And we certainly saw a shift in the early weeks of the crisis away from public transport and into private modes of travel before the government announced its lockdown, as people were nervous about travelling on public transport. So what I've got to do is look at all the options now available open to us to make sure that we get this right balance between enabling people to travel safely, which is obviously number one priority. Secondly, to ensure that we're doing it in a sustainable way. And thirdly, we've actually got a business that is able to operate and run in a sustainable way. And when I mean a sustainable way, I mean financially sustainable. So you know that the hit that the airline industry has taken over the last few weeks and is likely to continue for some time means that we need to be very careful about how we step through the next stages, not to disincentivize people to travel altogether.
Right. There is a question from Adam Reed. Have weight-bearing pedal vehicles been considered within the airport campus area?
Sorry, could you explain that one again, Linda?
Yeah. Have weight-bearing pedal vehicles been considered within the airport campus area?
I guess I'm not clear on what weight-bearing pedals are.
I'm not clear either, Tony. I'm presumably they're talking about some form of moving heavy goods by pedal cycle, luggage or something. I don't know. Weight-bearing pedal vehicles.
Okay. Well, what I can talk about is a couple of areas. Certainly around our
cargo bikes, maybe is what's been suggested.
Cargo bikes. So we're looking at electric vehicles on the airfield and how we can work with our ground handling community to increase the amount of electric vehicles on the airfield and moving cargo around and servicing aircraft and the like. From a pedal cycle perspective, we see that in a way more around our colleagues in terms of getting our colleagues around the airport, and literally we had a trial of we had 20 Brompton bikes that were all ready and installed in their lockers in the office at Heathrow, ready to be launched, just when 10 were electric and 10 were conventional, all ready to go literally the week before the COVID crisis hit. So you know, what we're looking at is a combination of measures depending upon the need, whether it's an individual need as a colleague traveling around the campus, or we need to move cargo. But we see on the airfield it's more likely to be electric vehicle than it would be pedal vehicle.
Or even electric bikes.
Yeah, and electric bikes, because of the distances traveling around the airport, that's where the Bromptons were coming into play. We had 10 electric and 10 conventional Brompton bikes, because that makes a real difference in getting people who otherwise wouldn't normally consider cycling to actually get on a bike.
Right, I'm going to ask you one more question, Tony, then I'm going to ask a question for both of you. So the question from Phil Jones to you, Tony, is what contribution will active travel, particularly cycling, make to achieving mode share targets for colleagues?
Yeah, we believe it's got a big role to play for our colleagues, particularly when you look at the demographic spread of our colleagues. Almost 20,000 of those 76,000 I mentioned earlier on live within 5 kilometres of the airport. So that's very much in that active travel zone. What we find challenging at the moment is that the provision for cycling isn't good enough around the airport. And as part of our master plan that we were promoting earlier this year as part of expansion, we had effectively a hub and spoke network that we were looking at how can we make sure we've got the right level of cycling provision in the new road layouts as we build out the master plan. What my team now have to look at doing is how can we increase that provision in the near term, recognizing that the expansion master plan, with the delay caused by the Supreme Court ruling, will be several years further away than we originally anticipated. So that's one of the things that the team will be working on later in the summer as we get through the crisis and say, actually, how can we increase the provision? And actually, we've seen an increased footfall through our cycling hub. So the airport part funds a cycle hub on campus, and with people being more reluctant to use public transport, we've seen an increase in people visiting the bike shop, getting their bikes out their sheds, getting them serviced, and using them for commuting to work, which has been really promising.
I have to say my experience of where I am at the moment is the volume of bikes has increased enormously in terms of people out on their bikes over this period of 6 weeks, quite substantially. Right, Cullen and Tony, how critical do you think closer integration of transport and land use planning is to support transport decarbonisation, and what do you think this means in practice? This is from Stephen Joseph.
Tony, do you want to?
Sorry,
yeah, I'll have to go first.
Go first, Cullen.
Sorry, Linda, what was that?
Would you go first with the question?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to go first. So, based on what we've seen at the moment, that critical integration of where people live, work, and play with the connectivity to the end uses of those functions, the live, work, play functions, is absolutely critical in terms of providing or enabling less reliance on gas guzzling modes of transport and mass transport interchangeably, and therefore being able to integrate first last mile functions in both master planning and development as a consideration in the planning system, I think is essential for the decarbonisation agenda. It's interesting, one of the other studies that we have in the retail figures is actually looking at the towns and cities that still have a market and a licensed weekly operating market, and how integrated those markets and town centres are for not enabling or for positively enabling more regular shopping trips, and therefore reducing the number of longer distance out of town once a week type shopping trips. That's still a work in progress. The short answer to the question is, I think the integration of first, last mile and land use planning and transport networks is critical to decarbonisation.
I'm going to come back right at the end to both you, Cullen, and Tony, and ask, how do we achieve that integration? So I'll come back, that's sort of as a final question, if I may, on that. In the meantime, Tony, your response to that particular question.
Yeah, I completely agree with Cullen. It's absolutely critical. And what we see at the airport is that the first and last mile acts as a significant barrier, particularly to our colleagues in travelling to the workplace by public transport, because more often than not, it's far more convenient for colleagues to jump in a car. One, because they get provided with a parking space, but also it's a lot quicker and it's a lot cheaper than what the public transport equivalent is, because there's a walk to the bus stop, and then there's a wait, there's lack of information, there might be multiple tickets if you're going on different modes, and we see that particularly because we're on the edge of London, and so we effectively straddle between the TfL bus network and then a whole series of different transport operators, different bus providers outside of London. And so having an integrated approach to that first and last mile, and seeing where we can go with some of the innovative technologies, the demand responsive services that are popping up now, in terms of how we can improve that first and last mile. So actually you're bringing sort of workplace and residential much closer together and improving that connectivity. Absolutely critical.
I think that leads on quite nicely to a question from Adam Reed, is, are there any targets that either of you know of in town planning for pedestrian only? I think it means in terms of mode share. It's not quite clear from the question, but any targets in town planning that either of you are aware of for pedestrians?
Not
No.
Not in terms of being part of planning policy. I think planning policy at that point becomes very wordy and aspirational rather than setting an empirical target. It always has to be related to context and geographical location, and I think the flexibility needs to be in that it simply is that if you provide the connectivity, if you provide the integration, you will promote and enable walking and cycling as viable modes of transport. To put a number on it, I think is too difficult.
Tony?
Yeah, very much difficult for pedestrian, a little bit easier for cycling. And in our expansion strategy, we were targeting 6% of colleagues to travel to work by cycling as a mode of transport. I think the closest you might have is what the Mayor for London has set out in his London cycling strategy in terms of a policy target, but I'm not aware of anything at government level.
I'd agree with that. There's nothing at government level that I'm aware of, but what we did say in the Better Planning, Better Transport, Better Places is for local authorities who know their area, picking up your point, Cullen, that they could and probably should set targets for mode share that they're going to aim for, just as Heathrow is actually setting mode share targets for the local areas or local places within the local plan. So that's one way of dealing with it, but not at national level, you're right. Okay, I'm going to go back then to you, Cullen, with a question that is from Martin Kelly. Do you think high student populations have an impact on how successful towns are? Students live close to the city centre and make fairly short journeys by sustainable modes.
I think yes, and I think thank you, Martin. I think the interesting thing is about how we define success and prosperity. So what we haven't done in our study is to mention any kind of financial performance statistic other than to just say, given the availability of floor space, X% is empty. It's not a statement about the function of that floor space that is occupied, or an indication of the prosperity of the towns and the cities that are there. So the first mile, last mile approach for me is very much independent of some of these other factors that sometimes confuse the issue when we try and talk about successful places. And from a physical point of view, first mile, last mile is quite simply, can people get within the first and last mile to the places that they need to get to for the functions that they need to deliver? Not the quality of those functions, but can they simply get there? And where that integration is highest, then it is not beyond reason to say they are probably financially better performing centres. And where you have a student population, because of the function of the old historical nature of the top performing three being university towns, then there is an argument to say that helps, but it doesn't actually change the physical connections just because you've got more students.
Right. Carrying on at the moment with yourself, Cullen, what's the average distance between origin and destination in retail centres? Do you know? This is from Ratnam Raja.
Off the top of my head, I don't know the answer to that question, but given it's within the GIS model, if we've got, I can provide the answers to that as a supplementary follow-up and give the statistics. Okay,
excellent. Thanks very much. And another question from Keith Dove to you, Cullen, is in relation to your presentation, there seems to be a relationship between the hotspots in Oxford and the main park and ride corridors. However, there doesn't seem to be the same for Cambridge. Any thoughts on why?
Again, there is a relationship. It's not in the study that we've done. It's not a causal one. It's just an explanation that actually these hotspots, they're not manipulated. They are physically due to the geospatial relationship, and then all of the other complementary characteristics, if you like, they're just additional. Gosh, that's interesting, but not causal in that. There are lots of things that we've seen in the study and in the study data that we say, gosh, that's really interesting. But fundamentally, the causal relationship in these hotspots is a geographical. It's a physical infrastructure geographical relationship.
Right. I think we're virtually there on the questions that I've received. But Tony, I've got another one for you, is predicting the future. How long will it take predicting the future, how long will it take to drones to transport people? How long will it presumably take drones to start transporting people? Interesting.
No, absolutely fine. And there's a number of companies out there that have already got some form of passenger carrying electric vehicle in prototype mode at the moment. So maybe not fully autonomous for many years yet. And then the other thing to layer onto this is the regulation that's required from a flight path and a safety perspective. Even many things. If you look at things like electric scooters, often it's the regulatory and the legislative side that takes longer to catch up with the actual technology. But there is some kit out there. I think you can do a YouTube search for some of it. At the moment, it's all driven with pilots, so it still needs human control, but inevitably it will head towards that. But I think we're probably many years away from that yet. I think autonomous taxis might arrive first.
I think I'm relieved to hear that, actually. That was from Francisco Ribeiro. Can I then ask you, Tony, and before we sort of wind up, could you just clarify for everybody, given the mode share targets that you've already have and are proposing projections that you're hoping to achieve, how far that presumably relates just to the defined Heathrow Airport and not to what happens on the periphery of that defined area? And have you any thoughts on the area that's outside the defined boundary?
Yeah, so the targets we've got are very much focused on passenger mode share and colleague car trips. So very much focused on the airport operation. We don't have any targets that when you go further out into the periphery, partly because it becomes very difficult to determine and monitor and measure in terms of what purpose that journey is for, whether it's an airport related journey or not. And so what we've tried to do is keep our targets to a way where we can actually measure the true impact from an airport perspective, as opposed to sort of spreading out into the local area.
Right, I've gained some more questions since I started asking questions, so I'll do one more. This is quite a long question. Has there been any consideration of how surfaces and structures across UK airport sites might be retrofitted in terms of generating renewable energy for operational and possibly first and last mile transport, as done in Cochin Airport in Kerala, India, where they have a vast solar panels across the estate, making them the first airport to run 100% renewable energy? Interesting question. Yeah. I think the last but one.
So we're already implementing solar technology in Terminal 2, which was opened in 2014. So the solar panels on the roof of Terminal 2 contribute to the energy consumption in the airport, and we're constantly looking at ways that we can enhance the amount of solar energy we can generate around the campus.
Right. I'd like to conclude, because we're basically going to conclude in a minute, by asking both of you, given that the focus of this webinar is about the integration of planning and transport, what would be the top 2 things you think need to happen to ensure that we manage to integrate planning and transport better than we currently do?
Gosh. Thank you, Linda.
Colin.
For me, it is sometimes to simplify what we try to achieve in planning new residential developments. We start with a very complicated approach to mobility, accessibility, connectivity, of trying to do everything. And I would say that what we found in the studies is that sometimes the very simplistic infrastructure-led approach of saying, can somebody simply physically, regardless of mode, regardless of socioeconomics, can somebody simply physically make a journey between origin and destination in a well-connected and simply simplify or easy to deliver route? Can that happen? And physically, that for me is always going to be the starting point for better integration, not necessarily trying to overcomplicate it with by what mode, by what surface, by what design. Does the line exist? Do the lines and nodes exist to enable journeys?
Right, thank you very much. And Tony?
So I'm going to come at this a slightly different way in saying what we do need to do is speed up how we make things happen. particularly when we're talking first and last mile, because there's so many different integrated parties involved. And so the two things I would call out to help things happen quicker would be, firstly, alignment of government policy. I think in certain areas you've got competing challenges around how to make things happen. And then secondly, there's a very complex layering of various government organisations, local authorities, transport operators that actually sometimes sort of all are acting with absolutely the right intent, but it means things take longer to happen. And I think if you go back to the Olympics and how the transport was delivered on the Olympics in bringing everyone together to achieve a common goal and a real focus and a drive, I don't think we have that similar focus in many of the transport objectives we're trying to achieve, because often people are pulling in different directions.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much to Cullen and to Tony for their excellent presentations and answering all the questions. Thank you to all those people that have joined in, of which there seem to be over 200 listening in. So thank you very much indeed, and I hope you found it useful. We'll be now signing out. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's still there, Tony.